Most of you, I imagine, are aware that Russia sent old T-62M tanks into the conflict, and many of you are probably wondering if those tanks would actually do any good. Well, that is what we are mostly going to talk about today. How good are those tanks when compared to some of the other tanks in the conflict? I will not be going into detail about other things since a lot of people already talked about those, but there are some things about the performance of these tanks that I have not seen mentioned anywhere. Most of the time you either hear these tanks are completely obsolete and have no place in this conflict, or these tanks are pretty comparable to the old T-72A or T-72M tanks we have seen being used in the conflict. Well, both of these are somewhat correct, but not entirely. First and foremost, from what we have seen in the past couple of weeks, these tanks have been given to the separatist units, so the Russian army is technically not using them. That being said, are these tanks any good? Well, yes and no. These tanks are T-62 tanks. T-62 is from the 60s, so when you think about that, of course it sounds like those tanks have no place in a modern conflict. But those tanks were modernized in the 80s. They got more modern fire control system with laser rangefinder, composite armor package for the most part, and new engines. That put them pretty much on par, or at least close to the T-72A tank at the time. Now, we have seen both T-72A and T-72M1, the expert variant of T-72A, which is pretty much the same, being operated in this conflict. This obviously brings up the argument that T-62M is good enough, since we have seen comparable tanks being used. You see, T-62M lacks one thing that the T-72A and M have: the ability to mount explosive reactive armor on top. T-62M was made on the T-62 tank, and as such, already added a lot of weight to the system that was not designed for extra weight. During the trials of T-62M, they discovered that the wear of the wheels and the suspension was significantly increased with the added armor, so they introduced some upgrades for those parts as well, just so the tank wouldn't destroy itself. But now that is it, you can't add much weight to the tank without suffering extreme wearing issues. T-72A was made with extra upgradability in mind, so a little bit of extra weight can be added to it. That is why we have seen a lot of the T-72A and T-72M tanks with added ERA on top. With added ERA, their protection is significantly increased and gives them the ability to stop a lot of things that T-62M can't, like some older but more common ATGMs like Conkers. T-62M's armor can only stop old RPG rockets, and that is it. There has been a recent video which showed some T-62Ms driving on the road, and we could see ERA being placed on the side. But that has been done because T-62M by default has no extra side protection, and this adds minimal weight when compared to covering the entire tank with it. Even relict side skirts have been seen being used on T-62M tanks. Don't be mistaken about the T-62MV though. We have seen this tank being deployed as well. This is a T-62M tank with ERA, but it lacks the composite armor, so it is basically a T-62 tank with the base steel armor and ERA on top, with the new fire control system and engine of course. To add salt to the wound, another T-62M variant was sent. This one has no extra protection. This is the old tank from the early batch of T-62M tanks which were made with no extra protection, but have T-72A smoke launchers added. This is a problem because it prevents the crew from placing any extra protection on the turret, and knowing how Russians operate, these smoke launchers will be useless. But all that being said, a lot of T-72M tanks that have been sent to Ukraine have received no ERA add-ons, and of course just use the base composite armor as protection, which, as I already said, is similar to the protection offered by T-62M's armor. In conclusion, T-62M tanks have a disadvantage because of the inability to place ERA on top of their composite armor, but some of the older tanks can be comparable to them. Now, of course, a tank is better than no tank, and I wouldn't want to be fired at by these tanks at all. They are worse than most, if not all, tanks that have been used in the conflict, but they can bring a lot of firepower to a fight even though they are old. That would be all. If you like my content, you can support me on Patreon. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a nice day.